Welcome back. In the previous two steps, we created the login functionality where we can actually go in, enter the user ID and password and log in. We can go to the to-dos page. Actually, we see the welcome page. We can go to the to-dos page, see the list of to-dos. However, this list of to-dos is hard-coded. What we want to be able to do is we would want to be able to get these from the back end. We would want to be able to edit them, delete them, and add new to do as well. To be able to do that, we need a lot of APIs. We need an API to add a to do. We need an API to delete a to do. We would need a API to get all the to-dos for a specific user. In this step, let's start designing those APIs. What should be the URL? What should be the method which should be used? Should we use a get? Should we use a post? Should we use a put? Let's look at it right now. The services that we would need are: one, I would want to be able to retrieve all the to-dos for a user. The second one I would be to be able to delete a to-do of a user. Delete a to-do of a user. We would want to be able to edit a to-do, and we would want to be able to create a new to-do. Which request method do we use to retrieve all to-dos for a user? Typically, we would use get to retrieve all the to-dos for a user. And the way we would design the service is to have a URL users/username. For this user, we would want to retrieve all the to-dos. So we would want to do a get request to user/username. So this username would be a path variable, and we would want to get all the to-dos for that specific user. Now, how do I delete a specific to-do? The way I can do that is by using the delete method. So I'll use delete request method, and you'd want to pass in which to-do you would want to delete. So to-do underscore ID. Now, if you want to edit a to-do, how do we do that? The way we can do that is by using put method. Whenever you'd want to edit or update, edit is nothing but an update. Whenever you would want to update a resource, you would want to use put. Remaining stuff would remain exactly same as the delete. So for a specific user, you would want to update a to-do. And the last one is to create a new to-do. Which method would we use to create a new to-do? We would be using post method. And which URL do you want to post to? You would want to post to the to-dos URL. So these would be the resources that we would be creating. So we'll create a get resource, a delete resource, a put resource, and a post resource. We'll start with creating this resource to retrieve all the to-dos for a user in the next step. I'll see you in the next step. Until then, bye-bye. Welcome back. In this step, we would want to create the retrieve all to-dos for a user get service. One of the things I observed when I went to the package structure is the way we have organized our stuff is not really perfect. So what I would want to start with is I would want to start with moving these two specific packages. So I would want to say this bean, I would want to move to a package called hello world. I did .hello world, do a control 1 or a command 1, and I'll say move hello world bean to that package. And I'll also do the similar thing with the hello world controller. So what I would want to do is move this to the hello world controller. I would want to move it to hello world package. Do a control 1 and say move. And now you'd see that everything is very well organized. So we have all the hello world services in a single package, and we have the RESTful web service application in the root package. That's cool. Just make sure that everything is fine by just running the services again. So this looks cool. If you go to the home and just do a get welcome message, this is working fine. So everything else is fine. Let's now focus on creating the retrieve all to-dos for a user service. What I'll do is I'll create a new class. I'll call this to-do resource. I'll say finish. As usual, we would add at rest controller annotation, press control space, and import the rest controller annotation in. What we want to do is we would want to create a get method. So public list of to-dos. So we would want to return a list of to-dos, get all to-dos, and we would want to be able to get them for a specific user. So get all to-dos for a specific user, and we would want to be able to return all those back. What we'll do to start off is we'll not really talk to a database. At the start, we'll focus on having a simple in-memory service. At a later point in time in the course, we will convert to using a JPA and Hibernate based service. For now, let's get started with very, very simple things. Let's focus on one thing at a time. Now, what I'll do is I'll create a new class called to-do. So control 1 over here, create class to-do. Let's go ahead and create it in the .to-do package and say finish. What I'll do is also move the to-do service to the .to-do package. Control 1, move this to the .to-do package. That's cool. There are compilation errors, that's fine. We'll fix them as we go. Public long ID. So we would want to store an ID. Should it be public? Actually, it should be private. And we would want to store which user that to-do belongs to. Let's do private string username. What is the description of that specific to-do? Private string description. You would want to store the target date. Private date, target date. And we would want to store the completion status. Is it completed or not? Private boolean is done. Let's import the java.util.date. Be careful with the import. It should be java.util.date. Let's quickly create the getters and setters for all the to-dos. So I'll create a generate getters and setters, and I'll say select all, and we'll create getters and setters for all this stuff, as well as let's create a constructor as well. The way I generated the getters and setters, if you are new to this, is right click source, generate getters and setters. And over here there are other methods as well. So you can generate toString, generate constructor, and all that stuff. I'll also want to generate a constructor. I'll do generate constructor using fields. So Alt-Shift-S and generate constructor using fields. So let's generate a constructor. Oops, it's created down here. I don't really want it down here. I would want it down here. So we quickly created a bean with a constructor and also the getters and setters. Let's format it, Control-Shift-F or Command-Shift-F, and let's go to the to-do resource and let's do an import of java.util. This is not really compiling because we are not yet returning a list of to-dos back. What I would want to do is I would want to create a service. So private to do, let's start with a hard-coded service. So to do hard-coded service and call this to do service. This service does not exist yet, so let's create it. Control 1, create class to do hard-coded service, and let's go ahead and create it in the same package, to do package. That's cool, and say finish. What I would want to do in the to do hard-coded service is I would want to be able to have a static list of to-dos. So I'll say private static list of to-dos is equal to new array list of to-do. Let's import the list, array list, control 1, and import it in. You don't really need to specify it in here because it's inferred from here. So let's import java.util.list as well. What we'll do is, for now, this would act as our database. So we would put all the things into this and we'll create methods around it. Let's initialize the data in this. So let's say static. So we'll create a static initializer block and add in to-dos dot add. Let's create a new to-do down here. So what all stuff do we need to create a new to-do? I need an ID. So for the ID, what I'll do is I'll create a quick counter. So I'll say private static int ID counter is equal to 0. And each time for every to do, let's do a ++ ID counter. So IDs would start with 1. And what's the next parameter? It's username. For now, let's hard code it to in 28 minutes. The next one is description. Let's say we would want to learn to dance. That's the first one. The next one is the date, new date, and for all the to-dos, let's mark them as false to start off. Let's do a control 1 and import java.util.date. Be careful with it. Java.util.date is what we want. And press a semicolon. Cool. Now we have this present. Let's decrease the font size a bit so that we can see a little bit more of this stuff now that we are typing in a lot of stuff in here. I would want to add 3 to-dos in 28 minutes. Learn to dance. I would want to learn about microservices. I would want to learn about Angular. Is that good? Now, let's start with creating a very simple method to return this list of to-dos, right? So, what do we need? We would want to retrieve all these to-dos back. What we'll do is we'll create a method called find all. List of user, find all, and list of to do. Where does the user come from? It should be list of to do, and all that I need to do is say return to dos. Cool. Now we have the to-dos being returned back from here. One of the things which we are doing in here is we are adhering to Spring Data JPA syntax so that we can easily switch to it later. For now, let's go to the to-do resource and let's make use of the hard-coded to-do service. Now, the first thing which we need to do is this should be a Spring component, right? So we don't want to create instances. We would want Spring to manage that. So I'll say add component. This is a business service. So a better thing to do would be to say this is an add service. Control 1, import add service. I'll remove the add component which we imported earlier. And now let's go back to the to-do resource. And now it's a add component. How do I get it in here? Add auto wired. So we would want to auto wire the service in here. We would want Spring to manage our dependencies. And now I can say return to do service dot find all. Now what URL do we want to map to this? We would want to map the get request. So get mapping. And what is the URL that we would want to map to this? We already decided that. It's /users/todos. So what I'll do is I'll take that and put it down here. And instead of user underscore name, we will use username. And this string username is a path variable. In Spring MVC, we already looked at it. The way we can use this is at path variable. Control 1, import path variable. Now I can import the get mapping in. Control 1, import it in and save this. Now you have a URL user name to-dos. Now if you go ahead and execute a URL localhost 8080 users/in28minutes/todos, you would see these to-dos present. One of the things is right now, as things stand, we are not really using the username variable. So whichever username you put in, the service would return all the to-dos which are present in there. In this quick step, we created a service. We wanted to retrieve a list of to-dos and we wanted to connect it to the front end. So we created a service and we are ready to connect to the back end. Let's see how we can do that. Until the next step, bye-bye. Welcome back. In the previous step, we got our retrieve to-do service up and running. So we have it running in the back end. And this is the data it returns back. We have our front end hard coded right now. So over here in the to-dos, what we want to do is we would not want to show the hard coded to-dos. We would want to show the to-dos which are coming from the back end. How do we do that? Let's solve that in this step. Let's go to our IDE and let's start with actually creating something similar to the Hello World service. Just like the Hello World service is responsible for getting all the Hello World details from the APIs, we'll create another API component. What I'll do is I'll call this to do data service .js. So let's call this to do data service.js. I could have actually called the Hello World one also as Hello World data service. Let's not worry about it right now. Let's go ahead with the to do data service. All that you need to do is do a class to do data service, and we would want to export by default an instance of this new to do data service. And let's go to the Hello World service and let's copy the import and let's copy the execute Hello World service as well. Over here is what we want to do is retrieve all to-dos, right? I would call this method as retrieve all to-dos. And what is the URL that we would want to call? This is the URL that we would want to call. However, we would want it to be customizable for users. So what we'll do is actually we'll pass in the name as a parameter, and instead of hard coding this in here, let's use dollar name, and now if I'm using dollars to replace values, I have to use ticks. So let's use a tick as well. Cool. So we have the retrieve all to-dos method ready. We have the to-do data service being exported out. Let's use it in our, where do we need to use it? We'll use it in the to-dos component, right? So list to-dos component is where we would want to use it. So I'll import it in here. So import to-do data service from, it's a little tricky import, right? We already did that before. Dot dot slash dot dot slash API slash to-do slash to-do data service dot JS. React defines a predefined life cycle for each of these components. So when a component is being initialized, what is the first thing that is called? The constructor. Whenever something in the component changes, whenever a state in the component changes and the view has to be updated for it, which method would be called? The render method would be the one which would be called. Similar to that, there is one method which is called when the component is loaded for the first time and shown on the browser. This process of actually putting the component on the browser is called mounting, and the method name is component did mount. Let's start writing the component did mount. If you hover over this, you would see that the help says called immediately after a component is mounted. Typically, the best practice suggested in React is when you're calling an API, it's better not to do the initial API call directly in the constructor. What happens if you do the initial API call in this constructor? The state will not be initialized until the API call is completed, and that's not a good state to be in. What we can do is initially we can set it to some empty state. So I can say initially the to-dos list is empty. So I can actually comment this out. Commenting the entire thing, all the fields which are present in here, all the hard-coded stuff that we had. So to-dos list now is empty. So what would happen? Nothing is shown. The initial render will happen with an empty list. And once this component is rendered, what we want to do is actually make the call to the API so that we can load up the to-dos. With this, we can make sure that the component is rendered and it's not really waiting for the data from the API. And once the data is appeared, once the data is populated again, the component will be re-rendered. Let's look at what happens right now. So in component did mount, what we want to do is to do data service dot, what do we want to do? Retrieve all to-dos. And we want to pass the name. How can we get the name? So I would want to get the name of the user who has logged in. How can I do that? We can use the authentication service. So what I'll do is I'll import the authentication service in. So it would be import authentication service from dot slash authentication service dot js. And now I can call let username is equal to authentication service dot, oops, actually there is nothing which returns a username right now in the authentication service. What I'll do is I'll actually create a new method. So I'll call this get logged in user name. And if username is null, then I'll return empty back, else I'll return the username back as it is. And I'll go here and make use of that specific method. So dot get logged in username. Now I can use the username of the logged in user and pass it to retrieve all to-dos. Now what I would need to do is the success scenario. What if it's successful? What do I want to do if it's successful? Think about it. Earlier when we did the welcome component, we actually tried to define a new method. What we'll do now is we'll try and define the method right here. Let's not try and create a new method. Let's try and define the state update directly down here. So dot then, what do we want to do? We would want to take the response, and based on the response we would want to do something. I'll put it within braces because that's the method body. First let's just log it. Console.log response. Let's see what happens right now. Let's refresh the page just to make sure and do a right click inspect, and you'd see, oops, course policy, it comes to haunt us again. It says cross origin is not allowed. Why? Because we need to add this on the to-do resource as well. Let's organize imports again and wait for a little while, and after a little while let's reload the page. Now you can see that I'm getting the data back. Data is being printed in the console, and you can see that if I explore the data, it contains ID, username, description, and target date, and done. That's cool. So now we can use the data from the response and set it into this state. Now what I can do is comment this and actually say this dot set state. I need to define an object. So curly braces, and in the curly braces, what's the name of the variable? To-dos colon response dot data. When you refresh the page, you would see that the to-do details are properly populated. If you go to the network tab and see the details, you would see that the request is properly going in and the response is coming back. What we have done in this specific step is we created the to-do data service. So we created the to-do data service. We implemented a method in there called retrieve all to-dos. We went to the list to-dos component, and in a lifecycle method called component did mount, we made a call to the to-do service, and we set the data which came back into this state, and thereby we saw that the data was getting rendered on the screen. In the next step, let's dig a little deeper into the lifecycle methods. So let's see what happens behind the screens. When is constructor called, when is component did mount called, when is render called, and what is the order. Let's look at that in the next step. Until then, bye.